So we're going to go on to our last session of the day, which is John Michael Davis, who will be talking to us about bridging theory and practice through classroom simulations.
Thanks, Ellie. Yep, happy to be the very last talk in an intensive day of engaging conversation. So hopefully we end on a good note here. So for the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to be sharing some blueprints for creating classroom simulations, and I'll demonstrate these through a guide that I developed that helps students experience some of the complexities of community-based research as I prepare them to engage with communities during their fieldwork. So it's not quite as ambitious of a simulation as Laney's full course simulation, but more of a modest one-class implementation. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of explaining my classroom simulation, it's worth giving some context on why I designed this and who it's intended for. So I teach at WPI, which is a STEM school, and it's a degree requirement for all students to complete what we call an interactive qualifying project in their third year, which is a team-based open-ended research project at the intersection of science, technology, and society. And about 80% of students conduct these abroad. So when they're completing their IQP, their interactive qualifying project, they have a 7-week prep term where they're working with faculty advisors in a sponsor organization that's usually a government office or an NGO from the community where the students will be working in. And they learn social science research and develop a research proposal for the 7-week research project term abroad. The projects that I prepare students for and advise are typically based in the global south or the third world or whatever terminology you're comfortable with, and typically involve community-based research. So in my class, I have an interdisciplinary group of students, about 24 students. And one of my learning goals is to get them to think about the process and challenges of community-based research and pragmatically how to conduct good interviews when they're in the field. So I found effectively teaching the practice of community-based research to be a real challenge when you're in the classroom. A lot of students, especially STEM students, don't find the material to be particularly relevant or stimulating. And based on my own experience, I'm a firm believer that community engagement is something that makes the most sense of experienced and not just talked about. And I've found that interactive simulations within the class can be an effective pedagogical tool that can spark student interest when you can't actually have that community engaged experience. So in a nutshell, classroom simulations provide students with facts about a situation on an underlying problem to address, and then they're inserted into that situation for a simulated interaction. The literature on classroom simulations talks about 3 stages that are required to create a well-designed simulation. So first you have the preparation stage, where students learn the theory and subject matter, which could include relevant readings or some context of the scenario. Second is the interaction stage, where students are putting their learning from the preparatory phase into action as they attempt to thoughtfully respond to the scenario that they're placed in. And finally, there's a debriefing exercise where students are given a chance to reflect on and internalize some of the lessons of the simulation. So to get the most out of classroom simulations, they should balance simplicity and complexity of the scenario, ideally maximize student engagement, and provide robust learning opportunities at all 3 stages: preparation, interaction, and debriefing. So I'm going to walk you through the one classroom simulation I developed, and it's based on my own PhD research, which works with a series of Palestinian villages known as the Westline villages that emerged this informal e-waste economy over the past 2 decades. And the economy in the Westline villages is built on going into Israel, collecting scrap metal, electronic waste, smuggling it over the border, and then refurbishing and dismantling the scrap metals for profit, which has caused this wide range of public health and environmental issues, but also provided this much needed source of livelihood in an economically depressed region. So there's these inherent tensions within the villages between stakeholders who profit from e-waste and those who suffer the environmental consequences. And so within this setting, for the simulation, I have 2 main learning goals for my students. The first is to internalize the value of identifying and consulting multiple stakeholders with different perspectives and priorities to understand and address contentious community issues. And the second is to actually practice conducting interviews, since my students typically conduct interviews as part of their research projects. So the simulation is divided into 3 components. First is the preparation phase, and I split my class into 6 teams of 4. 3 teams are identified as the researchers, and the other 3 teams are different stakeholders within the informal e-waste economy that have different perspectives, values, and understandings of the e-waste issue. The stakeholder teams are given a description of their roles and background information that they should be familiar with before the simulation starts. And I also assigned 2 readings. One is on good interviewing practice, which is a chapter from Lunenburg's book on qualitative research methods in social sciences. And the other is a reading on the considerations and challenges to define and identify stakeholder groups within communities. And for this, I use a paper that I wrote that also speaks about the informal e-waste economy. That's the setting for the simulation, but there's a lot of other good papers that illustrate these themes as well. For the interaction phase, I have my 3 research teams interview the 3 stakeholder teams one by one. And the interaction begins by first introducing the research teams to a contentious community issue of e-waste burning in the Westland villages. And they're tasked with understanding the, what are the causes, what are the consequences, and what are the potential corrections to this issue. And they do this by interviewing each of the 3 stakeholders, and I allocate about 20 minutes for each team to interview the stakeholder groups. And finally, for the debrief at the end is where the researchers reflect on their findings and the stakeholders comment on the interviews. And collectively, we reflect on the importance of effectively consulting with and identifying relevant stakeholders and ways to facilitate collaborative solutions. I'm just like dying from the heat right here. Okay. So here's what the simulation looks like in practice, which takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours to complete. And all these materials are in the shared Google folder. So if you want to replicate this or adapt it with your own community-based issue, you're welcome to use that material. So before the class begins, the students have been assigned their 2 readings and role descriptions. And at the beginning of the class, the 3 researcher teams are given a project brief, which reads as follows. So during the summer, the Greenville Society for Environment, or the GSE, a Palestinian environmental NGO, has received reports of a disturbing environmental crisis in a string of rural villages in southwest Hebron known as the Westland villages. Several citizens from the Westland villages have shared stories and pictures of widespread open burning that release large plumes of black smoke throughout the villages. The increase in open air and uncontrolled burning is believed to be associated with the growth of a local informal e-waste economy, which is said to have had significant adverse effects on the long-standing agricultural economy in the region. The GSE is a financially lean organization and has not had the surplus resources to investigate these reports on their own. This is where your team steps in. The GSE has tasked their team with conducting an exploratory, fact-finding analysis of e-waste recycling and uncontrolled burning in the Westland villages. Specifically, the GSE would like you to interview relevant stakeholders from the Westland villages that they've identified. So that is farmers, e-waste workers, and municipal government employees, to answer 3 main questions. So 1, what are the underlying causes of open air burning in the Westland villages? What are the environmental, public health, and socioeconomic consequences resulting from open air burning? And 3, what are some potential corrections to reduce open air burning? So within the classroom, I position the 3 stakeholder teams in different corners of the room, or if I'm doing it over Zoom, in different breakout rooms. And I give the teams 10 minutes or so to prepare. The researcher teams, they're preparing their questions and their interview plan. So thinking through who's taking notes, who's going to speak, how will they conduct the interview, the questions they're going to ask, etc. And the stakeholder teams are refreshing themselves on their background information and also preparing how they're going to be good interviewees. I also add in an additional wrinkle and give each interviewee a certain trait that might make them challenging to interview. And these are also common traits that I found when conducting my own fieldwork. So for example, the farmers might be guarded and skeptical and require some effort for the interviewee to get them to open up. The e-waste workers might be attention seekers and they talk over each other and exaggerate things to get the interviewer's attention. And I have the government employees as being a bit of a rambler who goes off topic and you got to kind of bring them in line. So this is also a fun way to get the students engaged, and I enjoy seeing their creativity. And I'm often surprised that they actually really get into the role when you give them a bit of a personality trait. So I give them 20 minutes for each interview. The researchers have about 10 to 15 minutes to ask their questions, and then 5 minutes to analyze the responses before moving on. And while the researchers are analyzing the responses, the interviewees, or the stakeholders, they're making notes on how the interview went. For example, there might be important information that they had that the researchers didn't ask about, or more subtle things about how the interview was conducted. I also like to break up the interview team so that half of them are conducting the interview and the other half are analyzing it, and then switching so that everyone gets a chance to participate and practice their roles, and then rotating so each researcher interviews each stakeholder. After the interaction, I guide the class through a facilitated discussion that reflects on and unpacks the outcomes of the interviews. So I begin by having the researchers describe their interview approach and discuss what went well, what they might do differently. And I also have the stakeholder teams reflect on the interview approaches that they felt went well, or things that the researchers might have missed. And then we discuss the findings from the interviews by going over the causes, consequences, and corrections of e-waste burning according to each stakeholder, and talk about potential problems that might arise if only one stakeholder were consulted or prioritized over others. And then finally, as a class, based on their interviews, we ask what other stakeholders emerged in their discussions that would be important to consult beyond these 3 initial stakeholders, so that you can better understand the e-waste issue. And this results in a mapping exercise on the whiteboard where we map out the different relevant stakeholders. So taken together, I found the classroom simulation to be one of the highlight classes in my course as I prepare students for their community-based research. And the lessons learned tend to stick with them as they engage in their community-based research projects. You can remind them of the class, and it is a vivid memory for them. The simulation has direct learning goals of practicing interview skills, which is mostly a process of realizing that it's a lot more challenging than they might have expected, and also internalizing the value and process of mapping and consulting relevant stakeholders to understand these contested and complex issues. There's also indirect learning outcomes. Students are working on a team, so they're developing their communication and teamwork skills, and also their ability to think critically. So of course, you're welcome to use this simulation, and it's in the Google folder. I've developed adaptations of it and change it slightly every time I do it. However, I find that the best simulations come from your own experience, and there's a good chance that in your own research, you've encountered contentious multi-stakeholder problems and can probably structure your own community-based research simulation that models what I've done with the Palestinian e-waste example. That's both high impact and low intensity to create. And it also makes it easier to work through the debriefing stage because you're a bit more familiar with the contextual information of the topic. So that's it. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to field any questions if we have any, or maybe we're all happy to take a little breather.
That was great. And I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chats. Oh, question, Romain, go for it.
I'm bored of typing, so hi, thank you for that, Jean-Michel. I call you. Thank you for that. Really interesting. I like doing these kinds of activities myself. I had a question just about, any sort of unintended outcomes or kind of surprises that came out of this.
Good question. And the one thing that I was most hesitant about when I did this the first time was like, were the students really going to buy in? And I think it's going to be different for every university, every student population, slightly different. So you have to have that in mind. But where I was teaching in the class I've had so far, I've been pleasantly surprised that they do their research and they really know the content for their stakeholder interview. And so it worked much better than I was actually expecting. Yeah, so maybe that's a pleasant unintended consequence.
Great, well, thank you. And that brings us just to time. So thank you all so much for such a wonderful first day.